because we're seeing an influx of more migrants coming through, even if the political message isn't that the borders are open. I think with the change of a new administration, maybe even more an open-minded, administration towards immigration, I think people are thinking and saying, well, maybe this is our time, this is our turn. And the reality is the borders are being crossed by more people, and so that's just the reality of what we're facing right now.
Jonathan, have you seen a demonstrable difference in what's happening at the border in the short time that the Biden administration has been in place? I know for a lot of voters, and particularly, we saw through our work with Vote Common Good, there were a number of white evangelical voters that kids in cages was a key defining issue for them, and was a prime motivating factor in why they didn't support the reelection of Donald Trump. And I would imagine that there's some expectation that things are going to be better now. Do you have a sense that things are getting better? And in what way? Is it just too soon to see that? I'm curious what your experience has been.
Totally. Thanks for laying out that context, Rob. I think that is something personal as well for me. Like I mentioned before, I think the suffering of other human beings is not something that I don't think any of us want to support, right? I'll say it again, politics aside, like it's the life of a human being. And and I think there still is a lot of hope. I think there's also even right now, we can all three talk about just the disinformation and the media bias that's out there. And I would say there is a sense of hope that things will be different. I think we've seen the root cause of inhumane immigration policy and what that's done. I mean, to a point where families have become separated from each other. And even, as of just in the last 6 months, like there's statistics of parents who haven't and kids who haven't been reunited. I was actually really encouraged this morning. There's an organization called Kids in Need of Defense, and they just published an article, I believe this morning, where they're stating that through their efforts, their legal efforts and their lawyers, they've actually reunited about 105 families or so from that number, which is extremely incredible, right? And I think many of this work is being left to nonprofit organizations, to grassroots organizations, and it's overwhelming. And so the hope is that the new administration will play a more pivotal role in a more humane approach to immigration, in a more broad and compassionate way to immigration. And I say all that because even just my desire for people is that it's completely overwhelming. Our federal infrastructure, as we've seen in the last several years, like we're not prepared, we're not equipped for the hundreds and thousands of people that are seeking asylum at our borders. It's overwhelming detention facilities, it's overwhelming border patrol agents, it's overwhelming the nonprofit organizations that are on the ground. And it's shameful to me that our government is in many ways relying on these nonprofit organizations to actually pick up that work, because nonprofit organizations, we're underfunded.
Yeah.
But yet we're doing a lot of the work that, that once people are released from detention, guess who is left to take care of these vulnerable people? It's the churches, it's the local nonprofits, it's the local refuge shelters. And many of us are in this work because of compassion and empathy, and we want to make a difference in the world. But we don't have the funding. And so there is hope, but there's also a little bit of cynicism, I think. And this particular news about more detention centers being open, especially to house unaccompanied minors, I think just strikes, a red flag. It strikes this sensitive nature of the work that we're doing, because we don't want to be, a part of these inhumane approaches where sometimes I think the government is trying to just figure it out. And I just pray and hope and wish that the right voices are at the table, that the right
Mhm.
voices are being considered, so that the policies that are being implemented and executive orders that are changing policy will ultimately give people just a fair opportunity, and
Yeah.
really not, and really prevent inhumane situations.
Right. It's charity is not a substitute for good policy,
Mm,
and shouldn't be expected to fill in the gaps when
hmm
bad policy dehumanizes people and makes life more difficult for them.
hmm
Yeah.
Completely. And that's something that, as the new administration took over, we at Border Perspective work with a network of churches and a network of local shelters along the South Texas region. And many of us were in conversations about, well, what is it going to look like? Who's going to do it? And I think hopefully, and I do see this a little bit. There's an open line of communication now. I think there wasn't there before to the administration, and
Mm.
I think I've even heard from other nonprofit organizations and leaders who are doing, even carrying a larger load right into this crisis, that they are being heard, that they are taken in consideration, their perspective. And so obviously, hopefully that will lead to better change.
Yeah. Jonathan, you mentioned you hope that folks coming across the border can, see a judge and just take part in the legal process.
Hmm
Can you tell us a little bit about what that process is? We hear a lot of arguments like, why don't they just come here legally? What does that look like, and why is it so difficult? You mentioned the overloaded system. Why is it so difficult to do it legally?
Totally. Definitely. Yeah. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions too that I often tackle, right, when unpacking a question like this, is that um, I think about the people who are doing refugee resettlement, and the type of just really detailed process that people have to go through to actually, eventually be granted refuge into the United States. And that is one of the most safe, secure, detailed process, that the government has in place. And in many ways, this is for people who are maybe who don't have access through the connection of land or the border to the United States. And this process has been completely respected because it's really thorough, right? And it's really safe for people, but it's also a long process. What we're seeing on the border is that people aren't necessarily going through this process themselves because they're in countries that are connected by land, right, to the US border. And so when I think about why people should be allowed to, to enter into a legal process and to be given a fair chance to, is that oftentimes we focus on the issue being at the border, but that is not the root cause of people fleeing their homes.
Mm-hmm.
The border is only an entry point for many. It's only a middle ground for their journey. We're finding out that people are not actually staying on the border, even though the entirety of the focus of the news is focused on this region. There's statistics. The Washington Post, even in 2018, followed 1,000 asylum seekers and actually plotted where they went. And they went to cities like Seattle and New York City, the East Coast and West Coast, and Florida, and all over, the United States. And so it's important for people to have a fair process and a legal process, because I, even if I'm a cynic, I still believe and I want to trust the legal process that we're in this nation. And seeking refuge and seeking asylum, especially for those who are persecuted and for those who have a legal case to seek refuge and asylum in another country, is something that is just a human right globally. It's backed by the United Nations. It's not just something that the U.S. gets to decide whether that's something that we do or not for whoever we choose to or not. It's something it's a global human right. And so it's a immigration, the border is extremely complex. I don't know, maybe if you're finding that out, the more that you talk about this and the more that you research, and the deeper that I go and the more cases that I hear, the more people that I talk to, it's just, I keep landing at that place. I can't be the judge of their story being true or not. I want to try. I trust the legal system that we have in place, and I want those people to go through that process. And so it's vital and important for people to go through that process. I think what we're learning is that there's not enough judges, there's not enough courts, there's not enough agents, and that's what's creating the backlog and really in many ways it's a bottleneck, right? That's why so many people are stuck on the border, and these shelters are overwhelmed because there's not enough manpower to really process people through to an already extremely complex immigration process.
Yeah. One of the analogies I always think about is that, water finds the path of least resistance. As it's flowing, it finds the easiest way to flow and goes that direction. And what does it tell us that risking your life crossing a desert, swimming across a river, scaling a border wall, braving the heat, and all of that is the path of least resistance compared to going the legal way through the system. That ought to tell us something about how profoundly the pathway to citizenship, the pathway for asylum seekers, needs to be addressed and needs to be streamlined.
And and that's exactly true. I'm actually Mexican born, and I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen as of just recently in the last few years. And so I've navigated that legal process myself. My family has. And I remember it took us about a decade. I was 7 years old when my parents actually immigrated to South Texas from northern Mexico. And that legal process as a 7-year-old kid, you're getting your fingerprints taken at a immigration office. They're telling you that they're going to do an FBI background check for your parents or whatever. I don't know what that means. I'm just a kid. As I grew older, I realized how complex that 10-year period was for especially for my mom and I, because my dad was the one that was doing the paperwork on our behalf and kind of asking, for our legal citizenship. And in that time period, even though we went through the legal process and we actually paid a fine and legal fees, we couldn't travel. We couldn't leave the region that we grew up in. My mom couldn't see her parents, and so it was hard. It was stressful because we had to be confined to a space, right? That oftentimes I don't know that many people know that. Some people are asked to be separated from their families. I have many friends who, whether they're marrying somebody from another country or whatever, sometimes, that person's being asked to go wait in their home country when they're already married in the United States. So their families become separated for various reasons. It's extremely complex. I'll say it again. And what you said, I think about the journeys that people are taking to as they seek freedom, as they seek a place to belong. And in the midst of this pandemic, I don't know, I've been moved by a lot of the photos that actually showcase how many people are waiting in line for a box of food at a food bank. I don't know about you guys. I don't have the time to wait 3 hours for a food box. Unless I really needed it.
Yeah.
I asked the question, would I just for fun leave Central America and journey north to a border where I might encounter violence and ultimately death? And and put my family in a very insecure and potentially detrimental situation through deserts and waters and land, I just asked that question because
Yeah.
I don't think if I was in those shoes, I'm gonna wait however long it takes at a food bank to get food.
Yeah.
If I'm fleeing violence, truly, if my life is at risk, I'm gonna I'm gonna do whatever it takes to find a better place for my family and myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jonathan, oh, go ahead, Rob.
Go ahead, Dan. No, go ahead, Dan.
All right. I was wondering, through your work, one of the things you do is try to help others have a clearer perspective, as the name implies. I was wondering if there's one or two stories you could share with us. Why do people flee? Why is this the best option, to risk everything, to traverse a desert, to, bring their kids along on a very dangerous journey? Why is that their best option? Are there one or two stories you could share with us?
Definitely, yeah, and there's actually many stories, and I think these are so important to the work that we do because in many ways when we invite people to come on on a border perspective experience or a trip, it's really through storytelling. I'm a very visual person. I'm also a person, I'm not so much of a classroom learner, but I'm more in the field type of learner, and I invite people into that experience as well. And I think about a couple of situations. One is the region in Central America where many people are fleeing from is referred to as Northern Triangle countries, and that's Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and surrounding communities and countries. And if you look back at the history of these nations and even the present day situations there, you'll find corruption, poverty. You'll find drug violence. You'll find the fact that there's kidnappings, that there's just a very unstable type of life and situation in a lot of these very much developing nations. Um, I think specifically about a story of a barbershop owner that I met at a border crossing a couple of years ago, and he had built a small business, just being a barber, and that's how he was providing for himself, for his kids, and his wife. And a local gang who he said is known to deal drugs and commit violence in their community started to ask him for a percentage of his profits because they said if you don't um, provide us a percentage of your profits, then you don't belong here. You're not a part of this community. Eventually, he didn't provide part of those profits of his earnings because providing for his family was more important. And so when I met him at the bridge at this border crossing in South Texas, he showed me a video of his barbershop being burnt down. And you could hear, because he recorded this, he was fleeing as people were shooting into his barbershop as well. And so I think about that specific circumstance, and I feel that maybe that's not all across the board. And I don't want to generalize all across the board, but this specific situation, this specific instance, somebody's fleeing for his life from organized crime, from people that want to harm him and his family. I think about the many mothers with their little babies who I've met from Cuba, which is a communist nation, that I met from Venezuela, which we know how Venezuela is right now. I mean, in many some of the worst news, people can barely find food in some of these communities and countries. Um, in last November, I was in a shelter in South Texas, in McAllen, Texas, and there was about a half a dozen women there, and they actually had been let through the border because they were deemed as vulnerable because of their pregnancy, and in the midst of the pandemic, the government actually allowed them in, and two of them actually had their baby while in that shelter. And so I got to meet both of their babies, and I just couldn't realize just the importance of welcoming, and really understanding that, in the middle of their trajectory, right, to give birth, um, they were also escaping this physical and external risk, and for whatever reason. And I realized that as people of faith, um, I just wanted to welcome them, because they were in a place of need. One of them came from Cuba, another one came from Venezuela, and they were fleeing. One of them was fleeing domestic violence, and actually didn't have a place to go in the United States because the only connection that they had was of someone that they knew as a friend, but they didn't feel that it was also a safe place for them to go. So their only place at that point was for them to stay at this shelter. Um, there's very traumatic experiences on the border. I don't know if you've heard, there was 19 bodies. I think that's the last count that I saw. That were recently burned and decimated on the Mexican side of the border. Violence is really prevalent on the Mexican side of the border. Drug violence is completely immersed into the politics and the everyday life of the border. People are fleeing that violence. They're risking their life, and many are losing their lives as they journey, to safety. We can't save everybody. I totally understand. But I think I just want to be compassionate and empathetic to the one right before me, right? And if I can do something, I want to do it. And so these stories are full of trauma. These stories are full of burden. And I don't know that many people will actually eventually unpack that in a lifetime, because of everything that they're fleeing from, everything that they're facing on their journey, and then everything that, and because I've seen this, I think everything that our policies are putting them through, whether it's in a detention center with maybe very little access to food, medical attention, maybe because we send them away from detention without shoelaces. There's a photo, you can read about that story in our Instagram. We met hundreds actually at a refuge center a couple of years ago, and they were being released straight from detention without shoelaces. Mm-hmm. And for a migrant, think about this, for someone fleeing for their life, they have to walk. Yeah. But we strip them of their shoelaces. Yeah. That just shows you the complexity of everything. Yeah. And in this particular shelter, they were using their emergency blankets and tying them around their shoes as shoelaces. Because that's
so it's hearing stuff like that, it's hard for me not to think about ICE agents and Custom and Border Protection agents as like and not the individual agents necessarily, mm-hmm. but the system that's in place that has empowered them. It's really hard not to think of them as a huge part of the problem, as mm-hmm. ICE and CBP is a part of the problem. I spent a couple of days at the border. It was just barely scratching the surface, compared to the work that you've done, Yonathan. So I don't pose this as any kind of expert or at all. It's just like, wow, I just had a little bit of exposure to some of this and was blown away by what I saw. But I think the thing that that absolutely blew my mind that I had no idea about after spending a couple of days in El Paso and Las Cruces and in the border between the two, was the realization that Customs and Border Protection is a federal agency that has jurisdiction. I think it's within is it within 6 miles or 10 miles? I can't remember the exact number, but within several miles of the border, they've got like full jurisdiction, and their power is not governed by the Constitution. Like there's things like Miranda rights and, innocent until proven guilty and, basic protections that people have that don't apply to CBP. And when you realize like where people live in this country and you kind of run that border all the way around, because it goes all the way around from, Texas to Louisiana to Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and then up the coast, New York, and then down the coast of California. And like something like 2/3 of the population of our country lives within that jurisdiction, lives within that band in which Customs and Border Patrol has kind of carte blanche ability to do whatever they want. And like you can see how a border crisis, and I don't want to be a fearmonger conspiracy theory kind of person here, because it's not how I roll, but I was terrified to learn that like if there's some kind of border crisis, you could see how quickly things could, turn into a martial law kind of state, not with changing anything other than like what's already in place. So, and certainly the attention of CBP is pointed at, people crossing the border at this point, but it very easily could be, pointed elsewhere. There's kind of this like, can you talk a little bit about like on the U.S. side of the border, the agencies that are patrolling and enforcing, and what kind of power they've got, and how it's the seemingly unrestrictedness of it has, what kind of impact that has on people's lives.
Totally. Well, that is complex, and I agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge complexity, especially when it comes to just law enforcement, their involvement, their jurisdiction, and I'll tell you this: like within the state borders on U.S. territory, Texas territory, there's been multiple times where we've been driving down just the highway, federal highway, and it's not uncommon in our area to see Border Patrol driving right next to you. It's not uncommon to see ICE vehicle right next to you. And oftentimes they just stop you because they want to question you. Maybe they, for whatever reason, think that you're suspicious. We were stopped a year ago, or in the spring, we were stopped multiple times because we were actually visiting just a local park, and we were in a church van, right? Like it's just a church van. But all the participants that were with me and the visitors that I had with me were actually just journeying the border to actually just showcase some historical sites, tell them a little bit more about border security, and just explain to them kind of the layout of the land. Mm-hmm. And just like local police can, state patrols, border patrol can also do this, and in some cases, the registration also goes, hundreds of miles into Texas territory. I mean, there's a border checkpoint about 90 miles actually from the actual U.S. Mexico border into Texas. And so in that stretch in between, it's not uncommon to have you know a lot of federal agents and being pulled over or stopped. I think about my sister and my mom who were traveling from South Texas to visit my sister in Dallas overnight one morning, early in the morning, around 4 or 5 a.m. And they were pulled over by a border patrol agent and they were questioned and they were, and where are you going? Why are you out here so early? And they just wanted to get an early start because from South Texas to Dallas, it's an 11-hour drive. You know what I mean? Like those types of situations. And sometimes something that the people, I think, unless you've traveled there, like you said, Rob, like even the few days that you spent there, you understand how militarized the border region is. One of the main questions that I often get is it safe? And I tell people, you have local police, you have sheriff, you have state patrol, you have border patrol, you have ICE agents, and in some cases you have the military, right? And National Guard. And it's interesting because my all my three of my siblings are actually going to university down there, and one of my sisters one time told me, it's interesting because having military presence in border communities, or at least even in our hometown, to some people it brings them a false sense of security. He said, but for someone like me, I'm just trying to go to the university and go to class. When I see a military convoy, it actually makes me fearful. I don't know how many other U.S. citizens across the nation can actually say that they live under a militarized zone. It's probably not many people. But that's what border communities have to deal with on an everyday basis.
Yeah.
And like my sister said, for some, it brings them a false sense of hope or security. For others, it makes them fearful. That's the complexity of the border. That's the complexity that we have to unpack and realize the authority even that these agencies have when dealing within U.S. territory. And like you said, I'm very much like you. Not I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist or even just put or fault one side versus another. I do feel for the agents that are having to deal with this. I've spoken through the years with many border patrol agents, and time again, and again, I don't want to generalize, but the few interactions that I've had, as much as they can share, is they say, well, we're just doing our job.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think what that signals is that they're just following orders from the top down. And some of the situations, and I mean, you've probably seen this investigating reporting, like agents sometimes are uncomfortable with the things that they're being asked to implement and the policy that they're being asked to follow. And I think that also shows just their humanity and their fragility in many ways. And in some cases, they are having to make the tough calls between something that might be completely inhumane, to maybe an approach that's more compassionate or empathetic. And there's so much there, right? Because people, whether you're a federal agent or a nonprofit worker on the ground, you're having to make these decisions all the time. And that's just part of regular life, dealing with border issues, immigration.
Yeah. Yonathan, I wonder if the system, A, seems to be overwhelmed, and so it can't even function as it's designed to function. But it also seems like the system itself is kind of messed up and cumbersome and sometimes cruel. I wonder if you can help us imagine a better system, a more humane and dignified system that keeps our border safe, but also offers dignity and safety. Like if you could get on the phone with President Biden, what would you suggest?
Totally. That's a really good question, and I thought a lot about this. And think about this. Oftentimes, and I love what you all are doing as well. Like, we're only presented with two choices. Why do you think that is? Right? You're either blue or you're red, right? You're either, you're this or that. And I think that's where we have it wrong. I think, let's say I'm against the border wall. Well, what does that make me? Well, maybe the other side is, if I'm against the border wall, that means that I'm for completely open borders. Why does that have to be the case? Right? Like, why can't we be for both? I think the complexity of the border is that we can't just have, these defined lines, that divide issues. There has to be a more comprehensive approach to what that actually looks like. Of course, I want border security. I want that for the sake of myself, for the sake of my loved ones, my friends, my community, and my children, right? And their future, their future generations. I love the United States. I love what we stand for. So of course I want to protect it. That doesn't mean that I'm also for everything that's against that. I think we have to move beyond just the two options that we're often given. In politics, in response, in national security, I do believe that there is a better way to try and encompass really dignified, humane treatment of those who are seeking refuge and asylum, and also truly believe that we can also be for securing our borders. The way that it's being done, I think even administration and, even just the last administration completely, I think that was a perfect example of like, it's either the wall or open borders.
Yeah.
The way that, when if we had more time, we could look at all the numbers, but think about just the massive budgets that go into funding the physical structure on the border and the border fence and wall. There's many advancements in technology. There's many more advancements, I think, even in recruiting more boots on the ground and agents, and actually equipping them to actually just have the necessary things that they need to actually just carry out their regular jobs. I wonder if, those millions and millions of dollars that it took to help fund a structure could actually be implemented for better training, for better security in regards to using technology to secure borders. I wonder if some of those millions of dollars actually were put to actually investigate and implement what are the root causes that are causing people to flee. Maybe it's working, with other local governments. Maybe it's putting in place, different types of conversations on the table where there is a more binational, bicultural approach, right, to why people are fleeing their home countries. And obviously, like, I don't want to come across as, because I don't believe this, like, that the U.S. is the savior of all. We're not, but we do have a major and huge global influence, and we have the infrastructure to back it up. That's the power of the influence that the United States has around the world, right? And so I think it takes a lot of work. I think it's easier to just have the one or the other. But I think we have to be given more choices. We actually, I do believe that it is the path less traveled, but we have to be willing to do the work. We have to be compassionate, empathetic, and dignify, and even in many ways, give people the humanity they deserve, but at the same time, keep our country safe, right? And most importantly, empower those people that we're asking to keep our country safe to have the adequate equipment and tools that they need to actually carry out their jobs. And so it really means going deeper for me. It's really having intentional conversations across the board, across the borders, and inviting way more people to the table than actually are allowed in right now.
Yep.
Because I wonder how many. Go ahead.
Yeah, we don't need a bunch of white men, dictating from thousands of miles away how all this needs to go down.
Yeah. And that's exactly where I was going with this point. Is like, I wonder how many delegations and other voices, right, we need from all these different countries that can actually help the U.S. government really understand the complexity of migration in these nations. I work closely with someone who works at a refugee ministry in the U.S., but had actually spent the early '90s working in asylum seekers in Germany. And this was many decades ago, right? But she said the difference between Germany in the early 1990s and how they were actually treating asylum seekers and the process and infrastructure they had in place, the U.S. has the U.S.'s approach is completely non-existent. Think about that. Just the major influence that we have in the world, the massive involvement, globally, the infrastructure, the finances. We're prioritizing certain parts of our infrastructure and funding that while completely leaving other areas in the dark, unfunded. Maybe areas and programs and policy and processes that would make us actually stronger, right? Not just for the sake of others, but for the sake of ourselves, for the sakes of how we're responding to one another, and for our ability to also support, what our nation stands for.
Yeah. So how can people learn more? How can they, what are there resources you would recommend? Like what, if somebody's listening to this going, okay, I feel like this is interesting to me, but there's a whole lot more here that I don't know. Like how can people learn more so that they can, make a positive difference?
For sure. That's a great question. And obviously, I'm being an immigrant myself, for me, it's a personal story. It's a personal part of my, just my upbringing and my family. And I know that that's not the case for many others, especially maybe listeners. But more than ever, there are a ton of resources out there. I know that we're working hard to get resources, especially from a faith-based perspective, that really expand our mind to understand just God's heart for all people. Really, what is our posture towards loving our neighbor, right? How do we do that in a way that reflects a faith perspective? And I would recommend, even if you just go to borderperspective.org, we have a PDF full of resources that has books, podcasts, conversations, research, statistics. That's one way. Another way is getting involved just with local community grassroots organizations that are doing work in your area, because more than ever, our country is becoming more diverse, and we're seeing our communities change. And there's people, maybe they don't have the loudest voice, but there's people that are doing the hard work. And for me, I think, yes, there's a lot of ways that we can intellectually learn about all of this. But like I said before too, I also just love to be with people. And I know that in this pandemic, that's hard. But I think there are people that are sacrificially doing really important work in our communities. How can I invite them to be a part of the conversation? How can I be a part of their table? And then, lastly, I would invite you to, if you can, go to the border. And maybe if you can't, well, maybe how do you invite that person who maybe has an immigrant background to share more of their story, right? And so I know that not all of us can be mobilized. I know that the pandemic is also hard on that specifics, but I think there are tangible ways, either by involving ourselves in resources or reaching out across, to people in our community to really help us on this journey to really understand a really complex topic of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, Yonathan, thanks so much for being with us. I wish we had more time. We could keep talking about this for a long time. We'll have to have you back on. But thanks so much for being with us. Our listeners and viewers can check out borderperspective.com or .org.
Both. Yeah.
Both.
Both
You
of
got
those.
them both. That's good.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah.
And definitely check out Border Perspective on Instagram. You guys have been really great on Instagram. I've loved your work there. It's visual and compelling and story-based, and so that's really great. Yeah, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you all so much for the opportunity.